She had immediately made friends with the bailiff's wife, and on the very first day she drank tea with her and the bailiff under the acacias, and reviewed all the circumstances of the situation. Very soon Matriona Filimonovna had established her club, so to say, under the acacias, and there it was, in this club, consisting of the bailiff's wife, the village elder, and the office clerk, that the difficulties of existence were gradually smoothed away, and in a week's time everything actually had worked out. The roof was mended, a cook was found, a crony of the village elders, hens were bought, the cows began giving milk, the garden hedge was stopped up with stakes, the carpenter made a mangle, hooks were put in the cupboards, and they ceased to burst open spontaneously, and an ironing board covered with army cloth was placed across from the arm of a chair to the chest of drawers, and there was a smell of flat irons in the maid's room. "Just see now, and you were in despair," said Matriona Filimonovna, pointing to the ironing board. They even rigged up a bathing shed of straw hurdles. Lily began to bathe, and Darya Alexandrovna began to realize, if only in part, her expectations, if not of a peaceful, at least of a comfortable life in the country. Peaceful with 6 children, Darya Alexandrovna could not be. One would fall ill, another might easily become so, a third would be without something necessary, a fourth would show symptoms of a bad disposition, and so on. Rare indeed were the brief periods of peace. But these cares and anxieties were, for Darya Alexandrovna, the sole happiness possible. Had it not been for them, she would have been left alone to brood over her husband who didn't love her. And besides, hard though it was for the mother to bear the dread of illness, the illnesses themselves, and the grief of seeing signs of evil propensities in her children, the children themselves were even now repaying her in small joys for her sufferings. Those joys were so small that they passed unnoticed like gold in sand, and at bad moments she could see nothing but the pain, nothing but sand. But there were good moments, too, when she saw nothing but the joy, nothing but gold. Now, in the solitude of the country, she began to be more and more frequently aware of those joys. Often, looking at them, she would make every possible effort to persuade herself that she was mistaken, that she as a mother was partial to her children. All the same, she couldn't help saying to herself that she had charming children, all 6 of them in different ways, but children such as are not often to be met, and she was happy in them and proud of them. Chapter 8. Toward the end of May, when everything had been more or less satisfactorily arranged, she received her husband's answer to her complaints of the disorganized state of things in the country. He wrote begging her forgiveness for not having thought of everything before, and promised to come down at the first chance. This chance did not present itself until the beginning of June. Darya Alexandrovna stayed alone in the country. On Sunday, on St. Peter's Day, Darya Alexandrovna drove to Mass with all her children to take communion. Darya Alexandrovna, in her intimate philosophical talks with her sister, her mother, and her friends, very often astonished them by the freedom of her views in regard to religion. She had a strange religion, all her own, of transmigration of souls, in which she had firm faith, troubling herself little about the dogmas of the Church. But in her family she was strict in carrying out all that was required by the Church, and not merely in order to set an example, but with her whole heart in it. The fact that the children had not been to communion for nearly a year very much worried her, and with the full approval and sympathy of Matriona Filimonovna, she decided that this should take place now in the summer. For several days before, Darya Alexandrovna was busily deliberating on how to dress all the children. Frocks were made or altered and washed, seams and flounces were let out, buttons were sewn on, and ribbons got ready. One dress, Tanya's, which the English governess was altering, cost Darya Alexandrovna much loss of temper. The English governess had made the seams in the wrong place, had taken up the sleeves too much, and altogether spoiled the dress. It was so narrow on Tanya's shoulders that it was quite painful to look at her. But Matriona Filimonovna had the happy thought of putting in gussets and adding a little shoulder cape. The dress was fixed, but there was nearly a quarrel with the English governess. Next morning, however, all was happily arranged, and toward 10 o'clock, the time at which they had asked the priest to wait for them for the Mass, the children, in their new dresses, with beaming faces, stood on the step before the carriage waiting for their mother. In the carriage, instead of the restive Raven, they had harnessed, thanks to the intercession of Matriona Filimonovna, the bailiff's horse Brownie, and Darya Alexandrovna, delayed by anxiety over her own attire, came out and got in, dressed in a white muslin gown. Darya Alexandrovna had done her hair and dressed with care and excitement. In the old days she had dressed for her own sake to look pretty and be admired. Later on, as she got older, dressing up became more and more distasteful to her. She saw that she was losing her good looks. But now she began to feel pleasure and interest in dressing up again. Now she didn't dress for her own sake, not for the sake of her own beauty, but simply so that as the mother of those exquisite creatures she might not spoil the general effect. And looking at herself for the last time in the mirror, she was satisfied with herself. She looked nice. Not nice as she would have wished to look nice in the old days at a ball, but nice for the object she now had in view. In the church there was no one but the peasants, the servants, and their women. But Darya Alexandrovna saw, or thought she saw, the sensation produced by her children and her. The children were not only beautiful to look at in their smart little dresses, but they were charming in the way they behaved. Alyosha, it is true, didn't stand quite correctly. He kept turning round, trying to look at his little jacket from behind, but all the same he was wonderfully sweet. Tanya behaved like a grown-up person and looked after the little ones. And the smallest, Lily, was bewitching in her naive astonishment at everything, and it was difficult not to smile when, after taking the sacrament, she said in English, "Please, some more." On the way home, the children felt that something solemn had happened and were very subdued. Everything went happily at home, too, but at lunch Grisha began whistling, and what was worse, was disobedient to the English governess and was forbidden to have any pie. Darya Alexandrovna would not have let things go so far on such a day had she been present, but she had to support the English governess's authority, and she upheld her decision that Grisha should have no pie. This rather spoiled the general happiness. Grisha cried, declaring that Nikolinka had whistled too, and he wasn't punished, and that he wasn't crying for the pie, he didn't care, but at being unjustly treated. This was really too tragic, and Darya Alexandrovna made up her mind to persuade the English governess to forgive Grisha, and she went to speak to her. But on her way, as she passed the drawing-room, she beheld a scene that filled her heart with such pleasure that tears came into her eyes, and she forgave the delinquent herself. The culprit was sitting at the window in the corner of the drawing-room. Beside him was standing Tanya with a plate. On the pretext of wanting to give some dinner to her dolls, she had asked the governess's permission to take her share of pie to the nursery, and had taken it instead to her brother. While still weeping over the injustice of his punishment, he was eating the pie, and kept saying through his sobs, "Eat yourself, let's eat it together, together." Tanya had at first been under the influence of her pity for Grisha, then of a sense of her noble action, and tears were standing in her eyes too, but she didn't refuse, and ate her share. On catching sight of their mother they were dismayed, but looking into her face they saw that they were not doing wrong. They burst out laughing, and with their mouths full of pie they began wiping their smiling lips with their hands and smearing their radiant faces all over with tears and jam. "Heavens, your new white frock! Tanya, Grisha!" said their mother, trying to save the frock, but with tears in her eyes, smiling a blissful, rapturous smile. The new frocks were taken off, and orders were given for the little girls to have their blouses put on, and the boys their old jackets, and the trap to be harnessed with Brownie, to the bailiff's annoyance, again in the shafts, to drive out for mushroom picking and bathing. A roar of delighted shrieks arose in the nursery, and never ceased till they had set off for the bathing place. They gathered a whole basketful of mushrooms. Even Lily found a birch mushroom. It had always happened before that Miss Howell found them and pointed them out to her, but this time she found a big one all by herself, and there was a general scream of delight. "Lily has found a mushroom." Then they reached the river, put the horses under the birch trees, and went to the bathing place. The coachman, Terenti, tied the horses, who kept whisking away the flies, to a tree, and treading down the grass, lay down in the shade of a birch and smoked his shag, while the never-ceasing shrieks of delight from the children floated across to him from the bathing place. Though it was hard work to look after all the children and restrain their wild pranks, though it was difficult, too, to keep in one's head and not mix up all the stockings, little breeches and shoes for the different legs, and to undo and do up again all the tapes and buttons, Darya Alexandrovna, who had always liked bathing herself and believed it to be very good for the children, enjoyed nothing so much as bathing with all the children. To go over all those fat little legs, pulling on their stockings, to take in her arms and dip those little naked bodies, and to hear their screams of delight and alarm, to see breathless faces with wide open, scared, and happy eyes of all her splashing cherubs, was a great pleasure to her. When half the children had been dressed, some peasant women in holiday dress, out picking herbs, came up to the bathing shed and stopped shyly. Matrona Filimonovna called one of them and handed her a sheet and a shirt that had dropped into the water for her to dry them, and Darya Alexandrovna began to talk to the women. At first they laughed behind their hands and didn't understand her questions, but soon they grew bolder and began to talk, winning Darya Alexandrovna's heart at once by the genuine admiration of the children that they showed. "My, what a beauty! As white as sugar," said one, admiring Tanichka and shaking her head. "But thin?" "Yes, she's been ill." "And so they've been bathing you too?" said another to the baby. "No, he's only 3 months old," answered Darya Alexandrovna with pride. "You don't say so." "And have you any children?" "I've had 4. I've 2 living, a boy and a girl. I weaned her before Lent." "How old is she?" "Why, 2 years." "Why did you nurse her so long?" "It's our custom for 3 fasts." And the conversation became most interesting to Darya Alexandrovna. What sort of a time did she have? What was the matter with the boy? Where was her husband? Did it often happen? Darya Alexandrovna felt disinclined to leave the peasant women, so interesting to her was their conversation, so completely identical were all their interests. What pleased her most of all was that she saw clearly what all the women admired more than anything was her having so many children, and such fine ones. The peasant women even made Darya Alexandrovna laugh, and offended the English governess, because she was the cause of the laughter she didn't understand. One of the younger women kept staring at the Englishwoman, who was dressing after all the rest, and when she put on her 3rd petticoat, she couldn't refrain from the remark, "My, she keeps putting on, and she'll never put enough on," and they all went off into roars. Chapter 9. On the drive home, as Darya Alexandrovna, with all her children around her, their heads still wet from their bath, and a kerchief tied over her own head, was getting near the house, the coachman said, "There's some gentleman coming. The master of Pokrovskoye, I do believe." Darya Alexandrovna peeped out in front and was delighted when she recognized in the grey hat and grey coat the familiar figure of Levin walking to meet them. She was glad to see him at any time, but at this moment she was specially glad he should see her in all her glory. No one was better able to appreciate her grandeur than Levin. Seeing her, he found himself face to face with one of the pictures of family life his imagination painted. "You're like a hen with your chickens, Darya Alexandrovna." "Oh, how glad I am to see you," she said, holding out her hand to him. "Glad to see me, but you didn't let me know. My brother's staying with me. I got a note from Stiva that you were here." "From Stiva?" Darya Alexandrovna asked with surprise. "Yes, he writes that you are here, and he thinks you might allow me to be of use to you," said Levin. And as he said it, he became suddenly embarrassed, and stopping abruptly, he walked on in silence by the trap, snapping off the buds of the lime trees and nibbling them. who was embarrassed through a sense that Darya Alexandrovna would be annoyed by receiving from an outsider help that should by rights have come from her own husband. Darya Alexandrovna certainly did not like this little way of Stepan Arkadyevitch's of foisting his domestic duties on others, and she was at once aware that Levin was aware of this. It was just for the fineness of perception, for this delicacy, that Darya Alexandrovna liked Levin. "I know, of course," said Levin, that simply means that you would like to see me, and I'm exceedingly glad. Though I can imagine that, used to town housekeeping as you are, you must feel in the wilds here, and if there's anything needed, I'm altogether at your disposal.